George Thornton was once the golden son of the Thornton family, heir to a vast business empire. Intelligent, kind, and loved by everyone in the company, he had everything, except the trust of his adopted brother Adrian. Adrian, envious and cunning, had always felt like George overshadowed him. One rainy night, George confronted Adrian about suspicious dealings in the company. Adrian's jealousy boiled over. In a moment of rage and cold calculation, Adrian lured George to the cliffside near the family estate and pushed him off. George's life flashed before his eyes. He thought of his dreams, his family, and a mysterious girl he had only recently met, Lila. Darkness consumed him. But death wasn't the end. George awoke in the body of his younger self, 10 years earlier. The trauma of the fall was gone, but the memory of Adrian's betrayal and the searing pain of being killed remained vivid. George realized he had been given a second chance, a chance to change his fate, protect those he loved, and seek justice. His eyes burned with determination. This time, he would not be powerless. George woke up in his childhood bedroom, the morning sunlight filtering softly through the curtains. At first, disbelief clouded his mind. "It's real," he whispered. Every memory of his death, the betrayal, the fall, the darkness, was painfully clear. But as he looked around at his younger self's room, George felt a surge of hope. He had 10 years to rewrite his life, to prevent the tragedies that had once destroyed him. He knew exactly where to start, Adrian. Yet revenge wasn't the only thing on his mind. He remembered Lila, the girl who had touched his heart. He vowed to protect her this time, to nurture the bonds he had ignored before, and to live a life free from betrayal. George began with small steps, studying harder, observing people carefully, and noting who could be trusted. At school, he noticed patterns in Adrian's behavior that he had missed before. Adrian's charm masked a dark ambition, but George's memories gave him an edge. By the end of the day, George made a promise to himself. "I will rise stronger, smarter, and untouchable. Adrian will pay, but not before I live fully and love truly." As he lay down that night, George felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. This rebirth was not just a second chance, it was the beginning of his true story. George quickly realized that 10 years gave him the perfect advantage. He began meticulously planning, not just to survive Adrian's schemes, but to rise above him. At school, he subtly altered his behavior. Once timid and accommodating, he now spoke with confidence, carefully choosing his words. He started forming alliances with classmates who could later become valuable allies in business and life. Meanwhile, Adrian's arrogance became more apparent. He was still cocky, still thinking he could manipulate everyone, including George. But this time, George was always one step ahead. He knew Adrian's weaknesses, his insecurities, and even his plans for the future. George also reconnected with Lila, who, even as a child, had a gentle wisdom that drew people to her. Their bond deepened quickly, and George realized that love could be a strength, not a distraction. She was kind, brilliant, and courageous, everything he had remembered and more. One evening, while reviewing Adrian's past schemes in his mind, George clenched his fists. "This time," he muttered, "Adrian won't get away with anything. Not the betrayal, not the lies, not the pain." The seeds of revenge were planted, but George knew patience was key. For now, he would grow stronger, smarter, and untouchable. As George carefully plotted his rise, he realized he couldn't do everything alone. He needed someone who could navigate the business world while he focused on long-term plans. That ally came unexpectedly, his childhood friend Marcus. Marcus had always been loyal but underestimated, often overshadowed by Adrian's charm. George reached out to him with a subtle offer. "Let's make sure the Thornton legacy stays where it belongs." Marcus, sensing George's determination and noticing the change in his demeanor, agreed without hesitation. Together, they started observing Adrian's moves in school, the family business, and even the social circles that Adrian aimed to dominate. Meanwhile, George's bond with Lila grew stronger. They studied together, laughed together, and shared secrets that only the two of them could understand. George realized love wasn't a distraction, it was a shield, a motivation that made him stronger. But Adrian wasn't idle. Even back in these earlier years, his schemes were beginning to form. He spread rumors subtly, tested George's reactions, and tried to gauge whether the younger George was as weak as he remembered. George smiled inwardly. Adrian didn't know that the George he once betrayed now carried all the knowledge of the past. The game had changed. That night George whispered to himself, "It's my turn now, and I won't fail, not ever again." George knew that patience was key. He couldn't confront Adrian head-on yet. He needed to test the waters, gauge his brother's strengths and weaknesses, and plan his moves carefully. At school, George started subtly exposing Adrian's manipulations. He countered Adrian's rumors with charm and wit, earning admiration from classmates and teachers alike. Adrian, confused by George's newfound confidence, began to show cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Meanwhile, George continued nurturing his bond with Lila. He discovered her passion for helping others and her sharp mind, and he secretly admired her courage. Every time she laughed or shared a dream, George felt a warmth he had never allowed himself to feel fully in his previous life. Marcus proved invaluable, digging into Adrian's schemes and reporting every subtle maneuver. Together, the trio began building a quiet but strong network of allies, all unaware of George's past life knowledge. One evening, while walking home with Lila, George saw Adrian lurking nearby, eavesdropping. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Patience," he whispered. "Your time is coming. Soon, you'll realize I'm no longer the boy you betrayed." George's heart beat with a mixture of excitement and resolve. The game of revenge had officially begun. George knew that timing was everything. He couldn't rush. He had 10 years to reshape his destiny, but it was time to make his first calculated move. Adrian had been plotting to sabotage one of the school's major projects, a charity initiative George had secretly supported. With his knowledge from the past, George anticipated Adrian's interference and quietly adjusted the plan. He ensured the project ran smoothly, turning what could have been Adrian's victory into his own triumph. The result was immediate. Teachers praised George for his foresight and leadership. Students who once admired Adrian began noticing George's intelligence, kindness, and subtle confidence. Adrian's face twisted with frustration. He hadn't expected the younger George to outmaneuver him. That evening, George met with Marcus and outlined the next steps. "This is just the beginning," he said. "Adrian thinks he's untouchable, but every move he makes, I'll be ready. And Lila, I'll protect her from him, no matter what." As George walked home, he saw Lila waiting for him with a warm smile. She handed him a small note she had written for the project, full of encouragement. George's chest tightened, not from anger or revenge, but from something far more powerful: love. For the first time in his life, George realized that revenge didn't have to consume him entirely. Strength, intelligence, and love could coexist, and together they would make him unstoppable. Despite his victories, George couldn't ignore the lingering shadows of his past life. Memories of his death, the cold betrayal, the fear, the helplessness, haunted him at night. He knew that Adrian's ambition wouldn't stop at small school schemes. It would only grow more dangerous over time. George decided to confront the deeper roots of Adrian's jealousy. He began quietly investigating Adrian's relationships, habits, and ambitions within the family business. He discovered that Adrian's thirst for approval often led him to make reckless decisions, something George could now exploit carefully. Meanwhile, George's bond with Lila deepened. She sensed a change in him, a maturity and intensity that went beyond his years. But she didn't know the truth, that George had already lived this life once, and that every action he took was part of a grand plan. One afternoon, as George and Marcus reviewed Adrian's latest manipulations, George's phone buzzed. A cryptic message from an unknown number read, "I know what happened to you, be careful." George's heart skipped a beat. Someone else remembered the past, or maybe knew of Adrian's darker nature. The game of revenge had just gained another layer, and George realized that allies and enemies could come from the most unexpected places. He looked out at the sunset, determination burning in his eyes. "I've survived death once. I can survive anything Adrian throws at me, and I'll make sure justice is served." George's careful planning was progressing smoothly until an unexpected betrayal shook him to the core. One of his trusted allies, a classmate who had always seemed loyal, secretly aligned with Adrian. It happened during a school debate where George was presenting a critical project idea. Midway through, confidential notes he had prepared were subtly leaked, making him appear unprepared and incompetent. Whispers spread quickly, and George realized immediately who had betrayed him. But instead of reacting with anger, George stayed calm. He smiled faintly, letting Adrian and the traitor believe they had won. Inwardly, he filed away every detail, the timing, the method, and the hidden motives. After school, George confided in Marcus. "We expected Adrian's tricks, but not this betrayal. That's fine. It's only made our plans sharper." Meanwhile, Lila noticed George's uncharacteristic silence that evening. "You're worried," she said gently, taking his hand. George hesitated but then nodded. He realized that sharing even a little truth with her strengthened their bond. "I can handle it," he reassured her, though the fire in his heart burned hotter than ever. "This betrayal will only make Adrian regret crossing me." That night George stayed awake, reviewing every detail. Every betrayal, every scheme, every past mistake Adrian had made, he would use them all. The pieces were falling into place, and soon Adrian's empire of lies would crumble. Despite the dark clouds of revenge and betrayal, George found moments of light, moments that reminded him why he was fighting not just for justice, but for a better life. Lila became that light. One evening, George and Lila stayed late at the library working on a school project. As they laughed and teased each other, George felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't allowed himself before. This was more than friendship, more than admiration. It was love. But even in these tender moments, George remained vigilant. He noticed a shadow moving outside the library window, Adrian's latest attempt to spy or sabotage. George's hand brushed Lila's lightly, a silent promise that she would be protected no matter what. Later that night, George reflected on his dual mission. Love and revenge were intertwined now. Protecting Lila, guiding Marcus, and outmaneuvering Adrian, it all became part of a single, unstoppable path. He whispered to himself, "I'll have my revenge, but I won't lose the people I care about. Not again." For the first time since his rebirth, George felt truly alive. Not just planning, not just surviving, but living with purpose and heart. With George growing stronger, more confident, and surrounded by loyal allies, Adrian began making bigger moves. He aimed to secure an early promotion in the family business by sabotaging a key deal. But George had already anticipated this. Using information from Marcus and his past life knowledge, George subtly countered Adrian's plan. He ensured the deal went flawlessly, impressing the board and even making Adrian look reckless. The result was immediate. Adrian's charm and cunning, which had always overshadowed George, now seemed hollow in comparison. Whispers about Adrian's impulsiveness began circulating in the company. For the first time, George saw fear flicker in his brother's eyes, fear of being outsmarted. At home, George celebrated quietly with Lila and Marcus. "Patience, strategy, and timing," he reminded them. "That's how you win without losing yourself." Adrian, however, didn't give up. That night George overheard his brother plotting with another ally, planning to frame George for a mistake that hadn't even happened yet. George smirked. "You think you can trick me? I know exactly how this will play out." He turned to Lila and Marcus. "This is just the beginning. Adrian's big mistake. It's only a matter of time before justice catches up to him." George knew that to finally take down Adrian, he needed more than clever moves. He needed a trap that would expose his brother's treachery once and for all. Using his past life knowledge, George orchestrated a situation that Adrian couldn't resist. He leaked a false business opportunity, designed to lure Adrian into making a reckless move. At the same time, he ensured that Marcus and a few trusted allies were positioned to gather proof of Adrian's schemes. Adrian, blinded by ambition and overconfidence, fell right into the trap. He signed documents and made promises that would later backfire spectacularly. George watched quietly from the sidelines, his heart steady. He didn't revel in Adrian's missteps. This was about justice, not cruelty, but a small part of him couldn't hide his satisfaction. Later that evening, George shared a quiet moment with Lila. She sensed the shift in him, the calm that comes when plans finally start falling into place. "You're ready," she said softly. George nodded. "Yes," he replied. "This time I'll win without losing myself or the people I love. Adrian's betrayal ends now." The stage was set, and George's path toward ultimate revenge and justice was clear. The day George had been planning for years had finally arrived. Adrian, confident as ever, walked into the family office expecting another easy victory. What he didn't know was that George had prepared every detail to expose him. With Marcus and a few key allies hidden nearby, George confronted Adrian calmly. "It's over," George said, sliding the incriminating documents across the table. Adrian froze as he realized the extent of his exposure. Every scheme, every lie, every betrayal meticulously documented. You can't," Adrian stammered, his arrogance faltering. "Oh, I think I can," George interrupted, his eyes cold but steady. "You've tried to ruin me, ruin our family, and manipulate everyone around you. But this time I'm ready, and you're not untouchable anymore." The board, who had been secretly briefed by George and Marcus, stepped forward. Witnesses confirmed Adrian's misdeeds. The once proud, cunning brother now stood exposed and powerless. Later that evening, George sat with Lila and Marcus, the weight of victory settling over him. But instead of gloating, he felt a profound sense of relief. Justice had been served, but love, friendship, and patience had been the real triumphs. George finally allowed himself to smile fully. For the first time since his rebirth, he felt whole, not just a boy seeking revenge, but a man who had shaped his destiny. With Adrian finally exposed and stripped of his manipulative power, George could focus on the life he had longed for, one filled with love, friendship, and family. He and Lila spent more time together, exploring shared passions, dreams, and even quiet, ordinary moments that George had once taken for granted. Lila's laughter became a balm to the wounds of his past, and George found himself opening up fully, sharing not just victories but fears, hopes, and even the story of his rebirth, though carefully, without revealing too much. Marcus, too, thrived. He had stepped out of Adrian's shadow and into his own light, forming a true partnership with George both in business and in life. The trio became a force not just of strategy and success, but of trust, loyalty, and genuine care. One evening, under the golden glow of sunset, George took Lila's hand. "I've had a second chance at life," he said softly, "and the greatest part is finding you. I don't want to waste a single moment of this new life without you by my side." Lila's eyes glistened as she smiled. "I've always believed in you, George, and now we can face everything together." For the first time, George understood that revenge was only part of his journey. Love, trust, and family were what truly made life worth living. With Adrian's downfall behind them, the Thornton family slowly began to heal. George's parents, who had been blind to Adrian's deceit, finally recognized George's wisdom, courage, and leadership. They apologized for the moments they had doubted him, and George forgave them, understanding that anger and revenge had already served their purpose. Adrian, now isolated and stripped of power, was forced to face the consequences of his actions. George didn't seek to destroy him completely. Instead, he allowed the truth to speak for itself. The once proud brother could only watch as George rebuilt his life stronger than ever. Meanwhile, George focused on creating a balance between ambition and heart. He invested in the family business with Marcus, taking it to new heights while ensuring it remained ethical and just. Lila became his partner not just in love, but in life, offering guidance, support, and companionship every step of the way. George also reached out to others who had been hurt or overlooked in the past. He became a mentor, a protector, and a symbol of hope, someone who had faced betrayal, death, and loss, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Sitting in his office one evening, George reflected on the journey that had brought him here. "I was given a second chance," he whispered, "and I made it count. This time life is mine to live fully and truly." George stood on the balcony of the newly renovated Thornton estate, the city skyline glowing in the golden light of sunset. Everything he had fought for, the revenge, the justice, the love, the redemption, had come together. Lila appeared beside him, her hand slipping into his. "It's beautiful," she said softly, looking out at the world. George smiled, feeling the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. "It is, but not as beautiful as this moment, being here with you, knowing we built this life together." Marcus joined them, grinning. "And to think 10 years ago, we never imagined it would all turn out like this. Adrian, he won't be causing trouble anymore." George nodded. "He won't. But even so, I've learned something important. Life isn't about revenge alone. It's about love, loyalty, and making the most of the second chances we're given." The three friends looked out over the city, the future bright and full of possibilities. George knew challenges would come, as they always did, but he now had the wisdom, courage, and heart to face them. As night fell, George turned to Lila. "Ready for our next adventure?" She laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Always." And together they stepped forward, not as victims of the past, but as creators of their own destiny. George's story of betrayal, revenge, and rebirth had ended, but the story of his life, love, and legacy was only just beginning.